Welcome to Aegis Room, Beyond the Ballot, a civic conversation about Nigeria's future. Our last conversation, we asked an important question. Does Nigeria actually have a national blueprint? Tonight, we want to take that conversation a little step further. In this conversation, we're trying to look at issues in Nigeria that we think are underlying problems apart from politics. Nigeria has had multiple development plans over the years, from Vision 2020 to current agenda 2050, but many citizens still question whether these plans translate into consistent direction. So if Nigeria were to define a clear long-term direction, we want to ask, what strategic path should Nigeria pursue? So tonight I have with me my dear friend, Dr. Abiye. He was in the last conversation. So I want to pick his brain to see what we can do differently. If, as a country, we want to define a clear and long-term direction, what strategic path should the country pursue? So welcome, Dr. Abiye. Say hi to the viewers and let's jump right into it.
Hello, Julius. Good to be on here with you again, and I am looking forward to another interesting conversation. And I hope that we continue to get more people, interested and also contributing to this conversation in the near future. Thank you.
Absolutely. And I was trying to bring on one of our friends who is very interested to join the conversation. She's an expert in cybersecurity and she was willing to jump on, but she had some difficulties to join us today. But I hope in the next conversation she will jump in. And also, I had some people that have messaged that they want to join the conversation. It's just for us to find the right time to get them in. But yes, thank you so much again for always showing up when we need you the most. So let's jump into it. What strategic path should the country pursue if we were to take a long-term direction?
It's a difficult question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Nigeria is a complex state, and I think that there are many competing values as well as interests that makes the Nigerian case study a bit more challenging to achieve a single. However, in the same vein, I can look at one of our most closest examples in terms of development. Not that they're ideal, but they offer a useful strategic pinpoint, and that's the United States of America. America is quite diverse as a country in terms of the people, the culture, and even the political economy. But they still find ways to make it work. Not perfectly, but most Nigerians would happily trade Nigeria for the US in a bit just because he offers more opportunities and whether it's been built so as an illusion or if that's the reality, that's a different question. But I'm saying that's a fair example, and I don't think any Nigerian living or dead would argue that that's it, where America is a better performing economy and a better performing political system than that we have. So if they can have something strategic, I think that we're able to have that. Much so for my digression, back to our strategic direction, I think that we need to be building Nigeria's strategic direction has to be one of a clear political will. And why do I say a clear political will? Because political will determines all of the other constituents of a society.
Yeah.
Without a clear political will, we have no society. So I came across a video. I've tried to look for it. I haven't seen it, but it was about China and how China's political will is centered on the principle of election by selection, something like that.
Yeah.
Where they select leaders. So if you were going to be in quote elected in China, you were essentially selected, and selection was done based on certain merits that weren't obfuscated by or marred by the inconveniences or the inadequacies of individuals. To be in that position in China, you were selected because you were competent, you had the background, you were fit for the job. So putting square pegs in square holes and round pegs in round holes, that sort of thing. And that's their political will. If we flip it to the US, it's more of a free will thing, like we want to elect, and probably, the people with the majority will eventually dominate for a while. And there's this circle that goes on and on. Nigeria needs to find what it's looking for. And I think that at the moment, the challenge that Nigeria has, if I look at, say, your Agenda 2050, which is what, 24 years from now?
Yeah.
And it's about, in quote, global positioning. But global positioning or global repositioning is a vague strategic direction. I put 100,000 naira on the ground and say, if we're going to Lagos today, we're going to Abuja, we're going to Port Harcourt, and we speak to 100 people in those cities, I can happily tell you that 80% of them do not have a clue about what global repositioning is about. So you cannot build a society like that. It's just rhetoric. We have to come to a better and clearer, properly communicated strategic direction that everybody ties into. And that's, like I said, from political will. What sort of political economy are we trying to build? Are we trying to build, a political economy of psychophancy, as we seem to have these days, or are we trying to build a political economy of competency? As we go on in the conversation, there are one or two points that I would want to, defer back to. I don't want to get into them now as we go on. There are one or two points to just underline why your political economy is absolutely critical when it comes to strategic direction.
That's great. Yeah. And like you say, as we progress, we tend to understand. Otherwise, I wanted to ask, what can we? Is the problem tied back to sensitization, education, citizens awareness, or leadership trainings, and all of that? But many countries that successfully transform their economies follow clear strategic path, like you have mentioned. For example, like in South Korea in 1960, they made a deliberate shift towards export-led industrialization within a generation. They moved from a low-income country to a global manufacturing power. Singapore as well, after independence in 1965, focused heavily on institutions, trades, and human capital. Today, it's one of the world's most competitive economies. Even closer to home, closer to Nigeria, we have places like Rwanda, after 2000, implemented long-term development strategies like Vision 2020, focusing on governance, service delivery, and technology. So the question here for Nigeria is Nigeria actually following a clear path like this, or are we constantly resetting? What do you think, or what are your opinions on this?
So it's difficult to say. It is difficult to say. My cynical side suggests that we do not have a clear path. It's a system that is very symbolic of constantly changing and moving the goalposts. But that's not necessarily bad in itself if you're responding to your environment. The problem is that moving the goalposts is very much about sensationalism and psychophancy. I keep deferring back to that. And I like the fact that you've talked about very critical countries, Singapore, South Korea, Rwanda, with relatable examples. Those are economies or societies that have come from the back. And they are fairly stable. They're attracting the investment. Their citizens are fairly comfortable. Life is good. I would happily take on Singaporean nationality or passport because it's good life. Same with South Korea, same with Rwanda. Well, in many ways. What do we need to do? I think that it boils down to perhaps three critical things, in my opinion, and I call them TIP. I refer to them as tip one, like you rightly alluded to, is trust. The second, or the I, stands for infrastructure, and the P stands for people. Whatever vision we are building has to center around those three elements:
trust, infrastructure.
And it sounds very, mundane or simplistic to say, oh, everybody knows that, but when you look at your national space, and I talked about the political economy earlier. If you go back to the examples of the countries that you've mentioned, your Malaysia, South Korea, Singapore, and Rwanda, there are certain themes that cut across. One of them, if you go and read the history of Lee Kuan Yew, it talks about how he built a system that was trustworthy. First, even before the investment in infrastructure and all that, it was first trust. Because if you do not have trust, then nobody, wants to have a relationship with you, and you only get relationships with dodgy people who are looking to exploit you. But when there is trust, people begin to see that there's some value in there. So you cannot have a political economy that is bereft of trust. Unfortunately for Nigeria, what we have now is a system that is completely bereft of trust. Completely bereft of trust. If we idea as to what do we do, or how do we make sense of what's going on, and link it back to what I initially said about your political will. At the core of our political will has to be a commitment to building a trustworthy and accountable system. Rwanda does that. I'm not a fan of Kagame, but there is a significant element of accountability in Rwanda. It's borderline dictatorship, and depending on where you're standing. But for many Rwandans, it's the representation of cohesion, it's a representation of hope, it's a representation of pride as a country. And to think that Rwanda has come from a dastardly civil war where millions were killed, just like the Nigerian civil war, but has somehow found a way to get on and develop ahead of Nigeria is mind-boggling. And at the
Yeah.
core of that is the idea of accountability, that there are no big dogs. There is only one big dog, maybe Kigame. But as long as you have that system working for the good of the people, people they're not really too bothered. So I would say that in that instance, would be one of the things that we have to focus in terms of our political will. How do we build a trustworthy system? And unfortunately, we don't have that at the moment.
That's quite good because, again, talking about pivoting into what you just said, last week you mentioned that we don't have, we're focusing or we're pursuing too many priorities. And you mentioned that if, for instance, Nigeria wanted to pick, say, we're focusing on power this tenure, these 4 years, let us focus and fix power for these 4 years, having like a priority and narrowing our priorities down. But if I borrow that and adding to this your point, I would say that I think we are trying to pursue too many priorities at once, and that is one of the issues that I can also pick from the conversation of last week as well to this very conversation. I know building a society of trust. It is very, very important because where there's no trust and accountability, where there is no trust and accountability, nothing will function. And again, there will be impunity, there will be lawlessness, and there will be more and more corruption. So interestingly, that will lead me to my next question. Interestingly, Nigeria Agenda 2050 aims to position the country as an upper middle income economy by 2050. That's what the 2050 agenda says. Many people would argue that awareness and continuity of that plan is still very limited. So our priorities clearly defined or just documented? I know you've answered it.
Yeah.
But
Go ahead, finish the question, sorry.
Yeah, so if Nigeria had to define just three strategies or just three strategic priorities for the next 25 to 30 years, I know that it's still a tricky question to ask and answer. Should those priorities be, if we need to prioritize three strategic stuff to do within the next 25 to 30 years, what should they be?
Okay, so I laugh now because the 30 years is a very long time.
Oh, absolutely.
I think that, again, I'm not exactly an economist, but I think
we can bring it back.
Economical development cycles are a lot shorter these days, and I think that they will get even shorter. And the reason why I say that is because there are tolerance issues within society. When our parents were younger, 25 to 30 years was an acceptable planning frame.
Yes.
Now that we are of age, 10 to 15 years is a long time. People say to be consistently online. In 2015, we made a mistake, and if you were 25 when Buhari came into power in 2015, this is what 20. Did Buhari come into power in 2015?
Yeah, 2015.
Yeah, 20. People say, oh, this is 2020, 26. You'll be 36 or 35 at some point, and that's 10 years, a decade of your life wasted, and then you go into your fourth phase, and if you don't have anything. So the point is, maybe politicians don't realize, but the threshold for tolerance for political economies and for economical cycles is reducing, is becoming shorter, react to changes within shorter period. So my advocacy would be that planning is done on a 10-year spectrum. And the reason why for that is because we know now that planning is not permanent, and we also know that life can be disrupted quite easily. So it's about planning in blocks where you build on progress that you have made within certain cycles. So even if we were to go to 15 years, it probably makes sense, because to be frank, between me and yourself, in 25, 30 years, we're probably putting on, granddad nappies and maybe in a home, or, if we're trying to be yuppie, trying to attend, old people's evenings and all that stuff. So I just thought I'd put that in. Back to the core of the question, I still, well, it's, like I said, it still boils down to three things. So trust, infrastructure, and people. In terms of trust, what are we looking at? We're looking at building institutions that promote probity, accountability, and predictability. Those three things. I want to know, if I go into business with you and you try to cheat me, if we went to court, the issue will be looked at, fairly, and one of us will be held accountable, irrespective of whether the judge is my brother, my uncle, my sister, or just somebody who likes me. That there is some level of fairness. That fairness is the norm, not the exception, in your judicial system. So that starts from a shift in our political will and our political mentality, where it's not about my uncle is the local government chairman, so everything he does has to be right, or I have to support him on everything he does, just because he's my relative, etc. That sort of stuff. So that's important. And then the rule of law, because there is no society that develops and thrives without the rule of law. There's none. Even if you go to the extremes of maybe the Saudis, where you say, oh, they're built on, religious norms, and you have these powerful monarchies that rule, there is a rule of law. If you steal, your hands get chopped off. If you do this, you have exceptions that it doesn't apply to in a royal family. But generally, even I have never been to Saudi, but the impression I have is if you go to Saudi, you got to behave yourself, because this is what will happen. If you go to Dubai, this is what will happen. So there is a rule of law, there is probity, and there's transparency. We may not always like it, it may not be perfect, but that's the general norm. Secondly, when we talk about infrastructure, I think that there are two things we have to deal with under infrastructure. One is mobility, so transport. How do people move from point A to point B? How do goods move from point A to point B? And then secondly is the issue of power. Again, I would bet probably, a good significant amount of money that you're not going anywhere. You can travel to China and sign $1 trillion deal, go to Brazil and sign $1 billion deal, etc., and make all. My brother, if you don't have access to power, lip service, it's a waste of time. Absolute waste of time. We have seen enough to know that it's a waste of time. So let's stop the gimmick, and if we're serious about developing as a country, begin to do something about our power situation as well as transport, because those two things are important, extremely important. They underpin any system that you look at. Even when you look at the revolution or evolution of man and our development, some of the key development cycles have related to those two things. When your the engine was developed, it was one of those stages where humanity leaped, because for the first time you could move from point A to point B with speed. With smaller limitations. We didn't have to sail for 250 days or 3 years to get from maybe Asia to Africa, etc., and all that stuff. No, you were doing it in a day. That changed the face of global competition, changed the face of the global economy. So if you don't have power and you don't have transport or mobility, you're deceiving yourself. And then thirdly, I'll defer to the issue of people. People, two things. You want a healthy society, and two, you want an educated society. Now, education doesn't have to be about everybody getting a degree. I am a strong advocate for people going to university and studying, because I think that when we get it right, it helps to shape the mind, shape to be in a certain way, but to shape the mind to be able to explore, question, and to think. So you cannot achieve innovation without some sort of abstraction and theoretical thinking. However, on the flip side, our education has to also focus on vocational skills that will drive productivity when the need arises. We need those skills as well if you're going to achieve your goals. So that's very important, but also you need a healthy population. You need people that are in fairly good nick to be able to run your factories, or to be able to run your production lines, or to be able to think, to work, etc. So we need to have those investments. So I think looking at those three things, if I was in power today, those would be my three priorities over the space of 10 years. That in 10 years, these three things, we want to get them right. So I want to get public institutions accountable. I want to improve trust in public institutions and in public systems. I want to invest and empower people in terms of health and education as priorities. And then finally, I'm talking, be 20-30% of your national budget going on improving your transport and your power infrastructure.
Great. So you've outlined three specifics that if you have the chance today, it could be improved. The strategies one, you talked about the fairness. I remember, and the rule of law. I'll tie that together. I remember some days ago or last week, there's one guy online, very dark man. He mentioned about one Igbo man that was supposed to buy a land for about 650 billion. He paid the money, but the guy in question meant to sell the land duped him, a fellow Igbo man. What happened is that guy was relying on the fact that he knows the former IG and all of that. So he didn't pay, and EFCC bosses and all of that. So he refused to pay the man. But the new IG that came in have enforced, and yesterday the man had to pay like 200 million. So if there's a fair rule of law, and people know that, if I go to court, I'll win and all of that. So it will help improve sanity within the society. So I agree with you on those points. And then you talked about infrastructure, you mentioned transport, you mentioned power, and you mentioned people, where you gave the reason why those three specifically. Have we also left out one of the most critical aspect, which I think is also very important, which is security? Because without security, if you have all of these things, you still won't get investors to come in and invest in your society. You won't invest in a country where there's much of an unrest, and I think Nigeria currently, that one of, for me, apart from power and two that you've mentioned, it tops the list for me, security particularly, because that is one of the biggest issue I feel personally is it needs to be handled urgently. So economic strategy change with every administration, because if you see with every administration in Nigeria, like people tend to come, abandon projects, change their economic priorities and all of that. What if the country try to pursue too many of those priorities at once? What happens? And would any society progress in such nature? So that's some of the questions I wanted you to touch in like 30 seconds before I move into my next question.
Just quickly. So, obviously, you want consistency, and the
Yeah.
idea of economic priorities has to be understood in terms of context. So, economic priorities are staggered. The priorities of the UK post the Second World War was more around rebuilding. And once that began to build, by the time we got to about, I think, the 50s and 60s, people began to talk about welfare. And so you see the engineering of the welfare state. And afterwards, people began to talk about, building more capital intensive societies. And so you go back to privatization in the 80s under Thatcher, and then subsequently they talk around sustainability, etc. So when you talk about economic priorities, they are not in abstraction or in isolation. They're very much contextualized. And we ask the question, what's our priority at the moment? Or what's the context of our existence, or of Nigeria's existence as a country? And that then becomes a good place to, frame the discussion as to what your priorities are. And we're not asking because we want to look at where we are and so this is where we are and wallow. We're asking because we want to understand the challenge in terms of getting to where we ought to be and understanding that context. And then just to go back to your point about security quickly, I think that security is very important. For many decades, I have said that, security. But also, think about this, Julius. If a crime was to happen, is it likelier to happen in a dark place or in a well-lit place?
In a dark place.
Just by making power available, and accessible and affordable, you could probably be eliminating, and off the top of my head, I'd be guessing you'd probably be eliminating between 15 and probably 35% of crime in your country, just by having access to power. So yes, it's a challenge, and I don't think that you get the sort of power distribution that we're thinking of without some level of security. But I'm saying that if your priorities are right, and you focus on generating power, things will fall into place. Security is an aberration, or insecurity as we experience it now is an aberration. An aberration in the sense that it's a symptom of a bigger problem. So if we solve some of those problems, it becomes easier. If everybody in Abuja, if nobody in Abuja runs a generator and everybody has access to power, when kidnappers are coming into someone's house, or thieves are coming into someone's house, what's the probability that your neighbors will hear? It's very high. So you're up in the game. What's the probability that people will see a child being snatched and struggling with a stranger on that well-lit street, whether it's at night or in the daytime, and say, do you know this person, etc.? It's higher. But what's the probability that it will happen now? Zero, because everywhere is dark. And when people have generators, it's noisy. And when things are happening, most times you don't know, because when your generator is on, what do? Shut your windows, shut the doors because you don't want the sound. So you don't even know what's happening most times there. Or if they're quiet, soundproof generators, people don't pick up things. So it's doing more damage to us even realize. Our perception, relationship with the real world is extremely damaged. So I would say I'd prioritize those things. And I have a friend, he's also a professor, he's moved to this now, and he tells me a story, he told me 5 years ago, of how he used to work. He's an American Indian, and he used to work in Mexico, in the US, but they used to fly a lot of the pharmaceutical components from India into the US, and one of their shipments had to go to Mexico first before coming to the US, and it was what a good couple of millions what the plane was carrying. The plane landed in Mexico, and I can't remember the name, but basically these guys are Mexican special forces that have their own cartel. So it's like a cartel by the Mexican special forces, guys that have left the Mexican special forces, they run a cartel. They basically came to the airport, put all of them under, at gunpoint, and stripped the entire plane of all its components and went away. That's insecurity. He's been shot at in Brazil, in Colombia, in the fields, etc., and stuff, kidnapped and all that. There's insecurity, but would you go to Brazil?
Of course.
Would you go to Mexico? Yes, they've
Absolutely.
got. So we're not looking at a perfect society, and I'm not saying that's the experience I want for people. I want people to have, but I'm saying that in terms of priority, what are we doing? Because when you and I were young, Nigeria was relatively safe.
Yeah.
What did we do with that safety?
So many analysts, in backing up your point, many analysts argue that reliable electricity is the foundation of economic transformation. And according to the World Bank, unreliable electricity in Nigeria has been estimated to cost the economy billions of dollars annually. And many businesses rely on generations or generators to survive. like you said. So can a country realistically industrialize when businesses are generating their own power? Can a
No,
country
no,
survive with
no,
that?
no, no. That's why I said from the beginning, it's lip service, Julius. Any government, I don't care, APC, LPC, LP, NPP, but anybody that comes in and starts to talk to you about development, yeah,
Yeah.
and they are not focused on addressing your power issues, they're lying to you. It's simple. It's just not going to work. Even, I mean, from when I was this much well close to 25 or more years ago, I knew that the highest overhead for 70-80% of Nigerian businesses was energy cost. Whether you're a retail person who has a shop where you sell food, your biggest overhead is energy. That's not sustainable. And so you would always struggle. You can never prioritize things that you need to do.
So we from this conversation we can agree that electricity is Nigeria's biggest development bottleneck. From the analysis.
In my opinion, yes. And I did an article in, I think it was Vanguard last year, where, I ran some analysis and some numbers with like economies, Mexico, Turkey, and all that. And one of the things I highlighted was that by merely the absence of power is for our productivity.
Yeah.
So you and I are sat here now, we're trying to do something. The last thing we thought about in our preparations was whether we'd have power. I could be sat here with you and I could be cooking in a slow cooker. Yeah. I could be doing the dishes in a dishwasher and my clothes would be washed in a washing machine. I am sat here with you and all of those chores are being taken care of. We're not rich people in this country. We're probably, if we're lucky, borderline middle class.
Yeah.
But we're not even thinking of those things as luxuries or anything. It's just normal, life.
Absolutely.
Think of the number of Nigerians who have to choose between whether they have to use NEPA or energy when they have it to iron their clothes as opposed to working on an assignment or doing some reading or doing an experiment, get a saw out and do something, etc. Think about the time that we spend washing dishes manually. And I'm not saying that it's bad per se, but I'm saying that productivity time lost. Think about the time that's spent washing clothes with our hands. Yeah. That's time that a machine could have been running, that they're doing other things. You have a job, you work. Sometimes what's the word, when you multitask, you do different things. So you can set up your system, program a bot to do a patching or something.
Absolutely.
Whilst it's running it, you go and do something else. Most times in Nigeria, we have to be there to see things happen. We have to be there watching, etc. If you have to automate things, you pay a premium for it. And it's just the way it is, just the way it is. As a young man living in Delta State, at some stage I used to remember after work, I would go to a cyber cafe, in the night, and sometimes I would sleep there overnight because I was chatting to people abroad on Yahoo Messenger then. But the only time I could afford to use the internet as such like that in a cyber cafe was at night.
So coming to this now, understanding how critical electricity or power is for Nigeria. If power is central, what reform should be prioritized? And is the issues policy, investment, or governance?
I think
because
what? Yeah. Sorry, finish.
Yeah. So what? And again, what role should private investment play? Because we have all of these issues now. I know that we were told that it's being privatized in Nigeria. Why? Why are we not having that constant power? What's the issue? Is it policy, investment, or governance?
Okay, so I know some people would for this, but I think that it's more around policy and governance. I do not think, from my perspective, I believe that there certainly has to be under the control of the state, and power is one of them. I know that I live in in the UK, we have, power that is, our power is privatized mostly. But you can see that in recent years, there's been a lot of clamor for a lot of those privatized power and water resources to be brought back into state control because they are symbols of national security, in my opinion. That's one. Two, I think that is getting it wrong. We've sort of given politicians a leeway to do whatever they want to do, and we expect the private sector to pick up the reins or pick up, the challenge under the guise of privatization. If I know that the system is corrupt and I am stepping into that system to do business, I'm thinking of hedging my risks. So one, the cost that I will charge will be significantly higher. But more importantly, my attitude to the job will be probably inefficient because I understand if you understand transaction cost economies, where they talk about opportunism. I will try to take opportunity and take advantage of the system if I can, because I believe that the system take advantage of me if it can. Why is it important? If we look at the Nigerian case study, power privatization has come in, has or gone worse. Most Nigerians will say to you it's gone worse. Now, why is it gone worse? I saw that Nigeria is owing about 3 trillion or something to power generation companies. I don't know how.
Yeah, and that's because of the recent low supply of power that people are facing.
Probably they can argue that, but most people will say to you, we've always had low supply of power, band A or band B or whatever, band. So it doesn't make sense to me. And those private companies, if you go and check their books, I can bet you their CEOs are still going to be driving, top vehicles, etc. It's a bubble, my brother. Strip your empower the state, empower your state engineers to do the job, invest in your infrastructure. If the state has to go and borrow from an international community to take advantage and to drive that, do it. But you cannot outsource your energy sector completely and expect to get results. It's just not going to work. If private enterprises want to participate in the sector, that's fine. And this is critical also because I have discussions with several people for years, more than decades, about our power situation, and we want to discuss the opportunities for modular technologies. So modular power generation, where say maybe a community in and Kulama generate their own power, etc. So they're off the national grid, and one of the biggest points of challenge is your pricing mechanism. You're dealing with poor people.
Yeah.
Poor people have one big problem: affordability. So private investors rarely get it right with affordability, with customers that struggle with affordability. But we want to move these people from poverty because power will help them move from poverty. So the state has to take responsibility for that. So I'm not an advocate of privatization when it comes to. Yeah, I think that should be within the purview of the state. The state should, by all means, drive policy and governance, which boils down to trust. Because you and I don't trust, NEPA or PHCN or Disco, Disco, that. I see them mostly as charlatans. Nigerians don't have proper access to meters. You still have to pay for them. The practice of cutting off power supply to people for no reason, taking power when there is no reason, someone switching things off. There's a common theory in Nigeria, or common perception in Nigeria, that the fuel marketers pay your power generation companies to put people's power off so that people can buy more fuel to support their power generation, and then everybody gets kickbacks within the system, but the consumer suffers. It's not meant to be that way, and it's not going to work if we continue this way. So I think the state has to step in and cut its loss. And if you're working with private partners, you need to let them know that this is a period of incubation. We want to build our power infrastructure. If you're coming in to partner us, this is what you're dealing with. We are a poor country. I'll say it for those who don't, we're a poor country. And if you're coming to a poor country, then you have to deliver something. When Prahalad talked about the pyramid, it's gone off my head, of the pyramid strategies. So basically, their argument was built around making offerings and was affordable for those at the bottom of the pyramid. So you made money from scalability, economics of scale. So, volume, as opposed to, this is what the market metrics suggest. And if Nigerians are starting to pay 1/3 or 2/3 of what we're paying for electricity generation in Nigeria, it doesn't make sense. I saw somebody estimating that they probably spend about 700,000 a month on generators, etc. I don't pay anywhere near that in the UK. I don't.
Yeah. No, I agree. So it's crazy. Even recently, the federal government started using solar.
Yeah,
so we'll go into that. You've really. This is an interesting conversation for me, and it's one that I feel we'll touch more because of time. I wouldn't. I would just want us to summarize for today in the next session, because you've really put out a lot there for us to think about or dwell on today. So this very episode is meant to be a very long episode. It's meant to be like a 3 hours episode for us to delve deep. I know that you've covered a lot. You've talked about different things. That one of my question would have been if Nigerian politicians, just to wrap up, were watching today, or even leaders were watching today, what are those messages you have for them? But in next week or in the next episode, which is still going to dwell on this very topic, we'll look at oil dependency in Nigeria, our human capital. We'll look at the national direction, and I'll bring out questions around the institutional strength and all of that. So if Nigerian politicians and Nigerian leaders are watching this episode, all the analysis you've done, what 3 strategic decisions should they prioritize in the next 5 to 10 years? Just like you said, I know you've talked about this that we leave the power sector to private individual. The state have to step in and cut their losses. That is one that I can pick that. If they were watching, they'll pick that and said, we need to pick that. So what others, just to summarize in short, in a minute, other advice you have for them? Because I know I can go on and list about 5 or 6 things that you just in your last comment highlighted for them to pick. What would you add?
So I will put this in the frame of question. And
Yeah.
I don't necessarily have the answer to this, but I would ask the question to the average politician and say, what is your fear of a functional country?
Absolutely. What is your fear about a functional country? That's a great question.
Because I think that the ability to ruminate and respond to that question will help them to reflect and maybe see where they are erring. Because I get it. The average politician gets in and there's a pressure of I have to sort myself out, etc., etc. There's an underlying fear. But
Yeah.
forget the fear of, our sentiments and think if Nigeria is working today, Nigeria is a Singapore, things are good, there's gentrification where we need to, etc. And, good transport system, education, people are happy, the country is functional. What does that do to you? How is it a bad thing? So if they're able to question, we can then progress the discussion to say, okay, if the fear is valid, how do we address that fear? If the fear is not valid, we say, okay, your fear is not valid, and count our hands together to work and make the country functional.
Thank you so much, Dr. Abiye. Tonight's discussion highlight something important. Before debating election, as always, because every Nigerians, all we talk about is election. Before debating elections, parties, or political competitions, society often need clarity about their strategic direction. Today, Dr. Abiye have unloaded a lot for us regarding what we can do as a nation strategically to move forward. If a country does not clearly define where it wants to go, development effort can easily become fragmented. Perhaps one of the most important civic conversations Nigeria can have is not simply about who should lead, but about what direction the country should pursue together. So I'll leave you with the final question, or I'll leave you to go and dwell on this. And I picked this from the words of our core guest today, Dr. Abiye. The question he asked to the politicians who could be watching this: what is your fear of a functional Nigeria? What is your fear? That question is not only to the politicians. I will also leave this question to all of our viewers, all the citizens. What is your fear of a functional Nigeria? If Nigeria was working today, why are you scared of it? Or why should it not work? Thank you so much, Dr. Abiye. Honestly, I'm going to dwell on it as well. And thank you for always showing up. Next conversation will still be on this very strategic plan, and it's still going to go on. Yeah, it's a lot of stuff that had by you, and I have learned a lot in this conversation. I hope you all have learned a lot. Thank you so much for joining this conversation.
Thank you very much, Julius, and hopefully we'll catch up sooner and follow up on the conversation. Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much. Bye.